Historically, this is what we had. We would have a marshalling tent as central to all this. Now the process starts with the announcer. Sorry, it'd actually start with the marshals saying we're running out of swimmers. These are the little green dots waiting to be assigned to chairs. The marshals would let the announcer know we want swimmers up to event 36. So the announcers would call that and everybody would hear that over the whole grounds. Marshalling to event 36. Could someone update the marshalling boards, please? That's these. There'd normally be 2 of these so that everyone could see one, and eventually someone would come out and update that. It might have been, say, from 28 previously, so they'll fix that up. And so swimmers will straggle from all over the place and stand around at the back of the marshalling tent. That's what these green dots are. And here's what happens now. There is a check starter, and their job was to take the swimmers from the front row of seats here around to behind the blocks. The way that was done was sort of, some of it was done well and a lot of it was done poorly. I'll just mention what was what's the word? There's a susceptibility there. I'd often see this. You see, when a club's planning its swim meet, they'll get down, they'll fill all the other positions, and they'll say, who can we get to do the check starting? And someone will say, one of the senior girls who used to swim last season, not swimming now, perhaps we could ask her to come back. So that's commonly what happened. And she gets told, it's simple enough. You just take these from the front row of the seats here and you line them up behind the blocks. And then you go back and get the next lot. What they do is they stand here and they say, follow me, and leads them out to here, and then the swimmers will just sit in whatever seat they came to. Now they might be on the right lane and they might not. She'll just go back to get the next lot. The next problem with that is that there's no one there with the swimmers watching that everyone gets onto the correct block. This is what a check starter should do. So what happens is if you've got a blank lane, you've got swimmers on all these other blocks and you've got a blank lane, these swimmers standing behind here, when they hear the whistle, they'll all look up and this one will see there's an empty block and they go, am I in this one? And they'll jump up onto here and swim in the wrong heat. And I'll just explain what used to happen was in those days, all the timekeeping was done manually, and the data from that went from the timekeepers back to the recorders on recording sheets. Each timekeeper had a sheet that they'd write their time on for each race. Now, if the timekeepers were awake, they might notice in their program that they were supposed to have an empty lane and they've had a swimmer. So what they would do would be to ask the swimmer their name and write that name on their recording sheet, and that way this mistake could get fixed. But once we've got electronic timing, it's much too quick. There are no sheets of paper going back to the recorders. There's practically no way to detect this or correct it if it goes wrong. So there's a little susceptibility there. It's no better now with the newer system. With semi-automatic electronic timing, Yeah, that's no better. That can't be fixed. And it'll become more apparent when I'm talking about the new system. So going back, what happens here is when there's a start, these swimmers here, I'll stand up behind the blocks, the check starter has gone back. What's happened in the meantime? Once the check starter has taken a group from the front row of the seats and put them here, all these here will move up one. So this swimmer here will move up to there. This one here, move to there, here to there, until you're left with a blank row at the back, and the marshals fill that back row of seats from the swimmers that are standing around at the back of the tent. That's how that used to work. It still works as well as it ever did, and in some places, I know Moranbah for example, they don't have enough space here behind the blocks to put rows of seats for the self-marshalling system that we're implementing these days in most places. This still works as well as it ever did. So just be aware, if you go to a swim meet where they've got this set up, they'll if you see a big tent there with official looking people standing around, you'll know that when you're called up, you go to the marshalling tent. Now for the transition, a couple of things happened. Time was when practically all our pools were 6 lanes. So a marshalling tent with 6 chairs wide was sufficient. But now in some places we've got 10 lane pools. So we've added another 4. That many onto there. That's a pretty big tent. If those chairs are 1 metre apart, that's what 10 metres, 30 feet, about the width of this house. That's a big tent, and 10 times 6 is 60 seats. If you've got all those full, that's 60 swimmers, which for a lot of local swim meets, that's about half of all the swimmers that have been nominated. So that's getting a bit unwieldy. And the other thing that happened was, we'll turn this around. The other thing that happened was at championship meets, say something like the state titles, those that organise this realise that to organise all the tent marshals and check starters, they're going to have to run their events. Most of those would have been accredited as technical officials, and therefore they're entitled to have their expenses paid, and so that all adds to the expense of running a top level meet. So put these two things together, and I imagine that the powers that be said, no, too difficult, we're not doing this anymore. We're going to have to get all these teams to marshal themselves. So we don't have to have a marshalling tent and marshals there shouting their heads off to a big horde of swimmers. So this is how we got this self-marshalling. Now, these are the components to it. I'll switch this around again. Regardless of which way it's done, swimmers have usually consulted their program once they get to the meet and it's all set, and they'll write on themselves somewhere the event number and the heat number that they're in. And these days, for this self-marshalling, you'll also need your lane number. So they'll have a look in their program and they'll say, oh, look, I'm in event 4, heat 2, lane 5. And they'll write that somewhere. Event 2, heat 4, line 5, and that's where it all starts. So throughout the day, they don't need this until a bit later because we've got these other things. So that's the first thing. Well, the swimmers have written event number, heat number, line number for each of the swims they're going to do, somewhere where they can refer to it. Now, this is for the benefit of, for the purposes of self-marshalling, we have team marshals, affectionately known locally as tent mums, and they'll be listening to the announcements, because one of the requirements for this self-marshalling is that the announcer for every current swim informs everyone of the current event number and heat number, and that way the tent marshals know who to call up from their team to go up to the start end of the pool. When the powers that be said we have to get these teams to marshal themselves, what they decided was, and like I said, they were going to do away with marshals and check starters, what they decided to do was to have these so-called lane chiefs. And a lane chief is a marshal and a check starter rolled into one. So if you think that you don't need to know very much to be a lane chiefer, you have to know all the things that a marshal should know and all the things that a check starter should know. It's not just someone you throw in after you've filled up all your timekeeping positions. Now, the swimmers, remember? The swimmers, they wrote event number, where are we? Event number, heat number, lane number, somewhere where they could see it, and this lane number is what's vital now. Because what they should do is go to the lane chief that is on the lane that they're going to swim in. They should be remembering, in this case, lane 5. So you go up to behind round about lane 5 and you should be able to identify the lane chief there. Now, if they're doing all this properly, the lane chief should be identifiable by a high visibility vest. You've seen me wearing that. And they'll be carrying a clipboard and a program, and they'll be checking the seats behind the block and the swimmers that are standing around behind all that are not yet assigned to seats. You'll find that they are, just for organisation purposes, they are responsible for 2 lanes typically, with 3 or 4 chairs per lane. Now, after a start, what will happen is all the swimmers that are in seats will move along one, and so the seats at the back should be empty, and the lane chief will call out names and will assign those to their seats. So if you're at the back there with everyone else standing up, you've just got to listen for your name, and the lane chief will put you in a seat when it's your turn. Now, this is where things have been falling down a bit. If it's done properly, remember over here that a lane chief is a marshal and a check starter. So as I've written over here, the lane chief doubles as check starter. If they're not doing that or not doing it properly, then you may need a separate check starter who will go across all the lanes behind all the blocks and make sure that, well, here we are, ensures that every swimmer is in the correct lane in the correct heat. If any of that gets scrambled, the recording system can't unscramble it, and you'll end up with either no time or a wrong time. After this, there are other officials who take part in this, but you don't interact with those directly. Previous to this, all these others, the announcer, the tent mum, the lane chief, and perhaps the check starter, you may have been interacting with those, but these others up here you don't have to interact with directly, and that's the starter, for which I've written some instructions, but I haven't recorded a video yet. The technical officials who work the sides and watch the turns at the ends, if you want to know what they do, I do have some rules articles, or you can refer to the rules yourself. But I haven't done anything about training officials as such. Timekeepers, vital, and vital that they know what to do and what not to do. You can tell a timekeeper what to do in about 5 minutes. It takes another half hour to tell them what not to do and how to recover if things go wrong. I have done a video about that. And then these results go to the recorders, and finally you get your results published. Coming up, we come back here to these lane chiefs, and the next thing we'll do is I'll show you some diagrams about how this process is carried out.